The first enemy we're going to create will be the Zombunny. First, I'm going to go to the Models folder, and then the Characters subfolder. I'm going to locate the Zombunny model. Before I do anything with it, I'm going to select it and take a look at it in the inspector. You should have already looked at import settings for FBX models in a previous chapter. What I'm concerned with is ensuring that the animations are properly imported. In the Animations tab, I should see 3 animation clips: Move, Idle, and Death. Again, these should have been set up in a previous chapter. If not, feel free to refer to the chapter on animation to see how to set them up. Once I'm satisfied with the import settings on the Zombunny model, I'm going to go ahead and drag it into my scene. My Zombunny will use colliders, but won't use a rigid body for motion. Instead, it's going to use navigation, and therefore, it'll need a NavMesh agent. I'm going to add a NavMesh agent by going to Add Component, Navigation, NavMesh Agent. The default values on the NavMesh agent are sufficient. However, if I wanted my enemy to turn faster or move faster, I could always adjust its speed or angular speed. As it stands, I'm going to leave this the way it is. So that my enemy doesn't push into or push through my player, however, I do want to tell it to stop before actually reaching the center of the player. I'm going to do that by establishing a stopping distance. I'm going to set the stopping distance to 1.1. This will cause the enemy to stand far enough away from the player that it doesn't push it, while still being able to attack the player. Now that I have the NavMesh agent that's going to move the enemy around, I need to add some colliders. I don't actually need a collider for obstacle avoidance since the NavMesh agent handles that. However, I'm going to add a physical collider to the enemy so that the player can shoot at it with a raycast. You will remember that in order for a raycast to hit something, it needs to have a collider. The second collider we're going to add is going to be a trigger collider. This collider will be responsible for detecting when the player steps into it. When the player is within the volume of this collider, the enemy will know that the player is in range and can attack. To add the first collider, I'm going to click Add Component, Physics, Capsule Collider. I will see that the collider is added more towards the feet of the game object. I'll need to adjust it so that it's a better fit. First, I'll need to shift it left and right, and then I'll need to lift it up. Once I have it about the center of the model, I'm going to increase its height. That should make for a fairly accurate collision detection with the player's raycast. Next, I'm going to add my trigger collider for attacking. This is going to be a sphere collider. I'm going to add this by clicking Add Component, Physics, Sphere Collider. Since this is a trigger collider, I am going to check Is Trigger, so that it doesn't forcefully interact with the player. Again, I need to raise it up to about the center. And then I need to increase its radius. This effectively allows for the enemy to get right against the player and make an attack. We don't want the radius to be too big, or else the enemy would be able to attack from too far away. We also don't want it to be too narrow, or else the enemy will never get close enough to attack the player. Now that we have our colliders and our NavMesh agent, it's time to add our scripts that will allow our enemy to start chasing and attacking the player. The first script we're going to add is the enemy movement script. I'm going to add this by clicking Add Component, Scripts, and then I'm going to find the enemy movement script from the list. There are a few properties on here, but we really don't need to worry about them right now. The NavMesh agent and animator have been found automatically, and the runaway distance will be useful when we create the stink attack in a later chapter. Now, I'm going to click on the Game Manager. I want to make sure the player is set up as both the player property of the Game Manager script and also the enemy target. With both of these pointing currently to the boy game object, I'm going to hit play and see the enemy chase the player. We'll notice that there's currently no animation. That's fine, we'll be adding those animations in a later section. Now that the enemy is chasing the player, let's allow the enemy to attack the player. We're going to add the enemy attack script next. To do this, I'm going to press Add Component, Scripts, Enemy Attack. The enemy attack script is going to contain important differences between the different enemy types. The time between attacks will determine how quickly the enemy attacks, and the attack damage determines how much damage the enemy will do to the player. For the Zombunny, we'll leave it here at the default, 2 attacks per second, or 0.5 seconds between attacks, and 10 damage per attack. Larger enemies might have slower attacks that do more damage. Smaller enemies or faster enemies might have more attacks or faster attacks that do less damage. Let's hit play and see the enemy damage the player. We won't actually notice the enemy doing any damage. The player doesn't have any way of telling us what their health is currently, but we will see the player get defeated once the enemy has been in range long enough. Once defeated, the scene will restart. The last script we're going to need for the enemy is its health script. There won't really be anything we need the health script for just yet, but it will become important later when we start adding the player's attacks. So that we don't have to go back and add all the scripts to the enemies later, we're just going to add it now. To add the script, I'm going to click Add Component, Scripts, Enemy Health. The enemy health script has a lot of properties. Most of them can be left as the default. The first values, the health and score values, will be another important factor that differentiates the enemy types from each other. After that, we have our defeated effects, specifically what happens when the enemy is defeated, how quickly they sink into the ground, and how long their total death effect or defeated effect takes. We have a section for some audio clips, which we'll handle in a later chapter. We have some references to our attack and movement scripts, and finally we have some references to our components. If you'd like to do some debugging, checking the "isn't vulnerable" will make the enemy basically undefeatable. This will help later when we're testing out player attacks. It's important though to uncheck this later when you actually put the enemies in the game, or else the enemies won't be killable and the player is going to have a very hard time surviving. Now that the Zombunny has all of the appropriate behaviors, there's just a few more steps we need to complete to finalize this enemy. If we look at the enemy health script, we are going to notice under the components a property called hit particles. Now we haven't added any hit particles yet, and we won't cover the particle system until a later chapter. However, for our use in this chapter, we're going to use a prefab that contains an existing particle effect. I'm going to go to the prefabs folder, and then the effects subfolder. Here you will find hit particles. This has been added specifically for this chapter, so if you'd like to follow along, you'll need to be sure to download the chapter assets. The hit particle effect looks like this. If I want to see the hit particle effect, I simply need to drag it into my scene. We can see what it's going to look like. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove it from the scene because I don't really want it there. Instead, I want it to be a child of my Zombunny game object. I'm going to do that by clicking and dragging the hit particles prefab and dropping it on the Zombunny. Now I can see the hit particles as a child of the Zombunny game object. Now in the inspector, I can click and drag the hit particles game object from the hierarchy onto this property, or more simply, I can right-click on the enemy health script component and just say reset. Then it will automatically find the hit particles for us. Now that all of our properties are filled out, we simply need to tell the Zombunny what layer it's on. We do this by going to the upper right-hand corner of the inspector. I'm going to click the Layers drop-down, and I'm going to select Shootable. I'll be asked if I would like to make all child objects shootable as well. This isn't really necessary as none of our child objects have any colliders. However, just to keep everything on the same layer for organization, I'm going to choose Yes. Now that my Zombunny is completed, apart from the animations, I'm going to go ahead and turn it into a prefab. I'm going to do this by clicking on the Characters subfolder of the Prefabs folder in the project window. I'm then going to click and drag the Zombunny game object from the hierarchy, into the project window, turning it into a prefab. If you get any warnings in the console about animations, don't worry about it. Like said previously, we'll be adding those in the next section. At this point though, the behaviors of our Zombunny are completed and our enemy is ready to be a part of our game.